In the marble halls of the Reich Chancellery and the pristine offices of the German General Staff, there was a pervading sense of intellectual superiority regarding the United States in the late 1930s. To the aristocratic Prussian officers and the Nazi elite alike, America was a culturally hollow nation, a mongrel society obsessed with jazz, cinema, and consumerism. They looked across the Atlantic and saw a country with an army smaller than Portugal's, a nation that drilled with wooden rifles and drove trucks labeled tank during training exercises. Hermann Göring, the blustering head of the Luftwaffe, famously sneered that the Americans were good for making razor blades and refrigerators, but certainly not Spitfires or Panzers. They believed that war was a martial art, a clash of will and superior blood, whereas the Americans viewed it as a business transaction. This cultural arrogance would become the single greatest miscalculation in military history. The German generals laughed at the soft Americans, failing to realize that the very consumerism they mocked, the ability to mass-produce refrigerators and cars, was the exact skill set required to win a total global war. The awakening wasn't immediate, but it was seismic. When the order came to mobilize, the American landscape underwent a transformation that was almost violent in its speed. In Germany, engineering was a craft. A Tiger tank was a masterpiece of hand-fitted steel, built by craftsmen who took pride in the perfect tolerance of a transmission gear. It was over-engineered, beautiful, and terrifyingly effective, but it was slow to build and impossible to repair in the mud of Ukraine. In Detroit, however, the approach was fundamentally different. The auto barons didn't care about the beauty of the weld. They cared about how many units could leave the factory floor in 60 minutes. When Ford's Willow Run plant came online, the German intelligence analysts simply refused to believe the numbers. They were producing one B-24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes. The Germans were building aircraft like watches. The Americans were building them like toaster ovens. As the war turned into a grind of attrition, this industrial disparity began to bleed the Wehrmacht dry. The first true shock came in North Africa. Field Marshal Rommel, the Desert Fox, was a tactician of genius, but he was fighting a war of supply lines. He watched his tanks sputter to a halt for lack of fuel, his men scavenging for Italian rations, while the British and Americans grew stronger every day. There is a famous anecdote from the African campaign where a German unit captured an American supply depot. They didn't marvel at the ammunition or the weapons. They stared in disbelief at a chocolate cake. It was fresh. It had been baked in America, shipped across an ocean, transported across a desert, and arrived still moist. To the German soldier eating moldy bread and rationing water, the realization was horrifying. If the enemy could ship a fresh cake across the Atlantic, what could they do with artillery shells? It was the first crack in the myth of the soft American. The realization dawned that they weren't fighting an army, they were fighting a logistics company that had guns. The turning point on the Eastern Front, often attributed solely to Soviet grit, was powered by American steel. While the German generals mocked the Red Army, they failed to account for the hundreds of thousands of Studebaker trucks pouring into Russia through the Lend-Lease Act. The German army was still largely horse-drawn. Their logistics relied on millions of horses to pull artillery and supply wagons, animals that died in the Russian winter and needed fodder that couldn't be transported. Meanwhile, the Red Army became entirely motorized on American wheels. They could move faster, encircle deeper, and supply further than the Germans could comprehend. The German generals who had laughed at American manufacturing were now being overrun by Soviet troops riding in trucks built in Indiana. By 1944, the laughter had died completely, replaced with a grim, fatalistic efficiency. The air war over Europe had become a mathematical equation that Germany could not solve. The Luftwaffe had better jets. The Me-262 was light years ahead of anything the Allies had, but they had no fuel to fly them and no pilots to fly them. The American strategy was brutal in its simplicity: build more planes than the Germans could shoot down. The P-51 Mustang wasn't just a fighter, it was a symbol of mass production. They swarmed the skies. A German ace might shoot down 3 Mustangs, but the next day, 5 more would appear in the sky. It was demoralizing. The quality of the German pilot was rendered irrelevant by the quantity of the American machine. The industrial base of the Ruhr was being pulverized by day and night bombing, while American factories operated under bright lights, thousands of miles away from the nearest enemy bomb, churning out material in 3 shifts, 24 hours a day. Then came Normandy. The invasion itself was a feat of engineering that defied German logic. When the harbors at Cherbourg and Le Havre were heavily defended or sabotaged, the Allies didn't panic. They simply brought their own harbors with them. The Mulberry artificial harbors were massive concrete caissons towed across the channel, a triumph of industrial prefabrication. The German High Command had assumed that an army couldn't be supplied over a beach, but they hadn't counted on the Pluto pipeline under the ocean, pumping fuel directly from England to France. The Wehrmacht was fighting a localized war, while the Americans were fighting an infrastructural one. The disparity became almost comical during the Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's last desperate gamble. The German offensive relied on capturing American fuel dumps because their own tanks were running on fumes. Joachim Peiper's SS Panzers, arguably the most lethal fighting force on the ground, were brought to a halt not just by resistance but by empty tanks. In contrast, the American response was the Red Ball Express, a ceaseless conveyor belt of trucks driven often by African American soldiers, running day and night to keep the front lines fed. The American soldier might have been less experienced than the hardened SS veteran, but he never ran out of bullets. He never ran out of fuel. If his tank broke down, he didn't fix it. He went to the depot and got a new one. The German philosophy of repair and reuse was buried under the American philosophy of replace and advance. There was a specific psychological toll that this abundance took on the German mind. Interrogation reports from captured German officers in 1944 and 1945 reveal a deep sense of helplessness. One prisoner described his unit destroying 5 Sherman tanks in an ambush, a tactical victory that should have secured the sector. Yet, within 2 hours, 5 more Shermans appeared, followed by an artillery barrage so intense it reshaped the landscape. They realized then that individual heroism was useless. The bravery of the German soldier, the brilliance of the German engineer, and the tactical acumen of the German general were all being drowned under a tsunami of steel. It didn't matter if the Tiger tank was superior to the Sherman if there were 20 Shermans for every Tiger. The Ronsons, as the Shermans were grimly nicknamed for their tendency to catch fire, kept coming. The sheer wastefulness of the American war machine was its weapon. They could afford to be wasteful. Germany could not afford to lose a single bolt. The Liberty ship program was perhaps the ultimate insult to the German worldview. U-boat captains were sinking Allied tonnage at a terrifying rate in 1942, confident they could starve Britain into submission. But then the Kaiser shipyards began producing Liberty ships. These weren't pretty ships, they were ugly, welded tubs, but they were modular. The record for building a single ship from keel laying to launch was 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes. The Germans were sinking ships faster than any nation in history had ever built them, and yet the Americans were building them even faster than they could be sunk. The Kriegsmarine ran out of torpedoes before the Americans ran out of steel hulls. In the final months of the war, as the Allies pushed into the German heartland, the contrast was absolute. The German army was relying on bicycles, horses, and wood-burning trucks. The supermen of the Reich were scavenging boots from the dead. Meanwhile, the American columns stretched for miles, a river of olive-drab steel, soldiers tossing chocolate and cigarettes to civilians, driving jeeps that were produced by the millions. The Volkswagen factory, which Hitler had promised would build a car for every German family, had produced mostly military vehicles, and even those were scarce. The Ford and General Motors plants had put the entire world on wheels. The generals who had laughed in 1939 were now either dead, imprisoned, or hiding in the ruins of the cities they had sworn to protect. They had been right about one thing. The American military was initially inexperienced and chaotic, but they had been wrong about the only thing that mattered in total war. They failed to understand that the smokestacks of Pittsburgh, the assembly lines of Detroit, and the shipyards of Oakland were not just commercial enterprises. They were the engines of a new world order. The German concept of war was Napoleonic, rooted in the idea of the decisive battle and the genius commander. The American concept of war was industrial, rooted in the idea that if you throw enough metal at a problem, the problem ceases to exist. When the silence finally fell over Europe in May 1945, the physical evidence of this miscalculation was everywhere. The roads of Germany were lined with the burned-out husks of the technologically superior Panthers and Tigers, abandoned because they had no gas or spare parts. Parked next to them were the endless rows of American trucks, jeeps, and tanks, idling with full fuel tanks, engines purring, ready to drive another 1,000 miles if necessary. The laughter had been silenced by the roar of an engine that simply never stopped. The giant had not just awakened, it had trampled the old world underfoot, not with malice, but with the terrifying, unstoppable momentum of a production line that had no off switch. The lesson was written in the rubble. In a war of machines, the artist loses to the engineer, and the craftsman loses to the factory.